Hi guys, this is Korak from Edureka. Welcome to today's session on how to install Kali Linux. Now, before we get started with the topic at hand, let's just discuss today's agenda. The first thing we talk about is what Kali Linux is all about. Then we talk about the prerequisites of installing Kali Linux in your system, followed by the features of Kali Linux, the steps of installation for Kali Linux, and then finally we end it with the demo for installing Kali Linux. And if you do like our videos, please do subscribe to the Edureka channel. And if you're looking for a DevOps certification, then please do check out the link in the comments below. So let's get started. First up, we talk about what Kali Linux is all about. So when we talk about Kali Linux, we talk about the fact that it is a Debian Linux distribution. So basically, Kali Linux is Linux which is basically specialized for cybersecurity, for ethical hacking, and penetration testing, and all of that. So it is an open source build, which means it's basically free to use in a wide range of enterprise scenarios, right? And like I told you before, feasibility for penetration testing, data forensics, and ethical hacking is extremely high. So let's take a practical example. If you guys have seen the series called Mr. Robot, they have basically shown a very practical use of Kali Linux basically for hacking, for forensic data science, all of that. So that is the practical use of Kali Linux, and it is something which is basically built for professional use. You know, people who are into cybersecurity engineers, then ethical hackers. All of these people basically use Kali Linux. It's not like a beginner cannot use Kali Linux, but Kali Linux is basically not designed for general purposes, right? So it's basically developed by offensive securities, and right after that we see that it is basically a single root user design. So when I talk about single root user, basically we look at Kali Linux as a security and auditing platform point of view. Now this basically means that Kali Linux has many tools which can run with root privileges, right? So all of these ethical hacking tools, then analysis and penetration testing tools, all of these are applications where you need privileges, and for that you need root privileges. So Kali Linux nature is not to have a multi-user environment, right? It only supports single user environment, and that is why it is based on a single root user design. And finally, we see that there are over 600 pre-installed penetration testing tools and ethical hacking tools. So basically, this is what Kali Linux is all about. So next we come to the prerequisites of installing Kali Linux. Now first we come across the system requirements. The first thing we see is basically to make low-end Kali Linux without a desktop. You just need, if you want to make basic SSH, you need just about 128 MB RAM and just about 2 GB of disk space. If you're looking for a higher end system for Kali Linux, the requirements will be the default XFCE for desktop, and the aim for the disk partitions and all that has to be around 2 GB RAM and 20 GB disk space, right? Followed by, when it comes to, let's say, processors or let's say CPUs, right? You need at least a 32 or a 64-bit CPU, which is single core, with at least around 2 gigahertz of speed or better. Now, this you need because the better your Kali Linux system performs, the better it is for you, right? Performance matters when it comes to Kali Linux because it is extensively used in the industry by professionals. And most importantly, you need a bootable CD or a DVD drive, right? Or even a USB stick and good internet broadband connectivity. Now, finally, we talk about the processor. Now, when it comes to the processor, Kali Linux has to have a minimum of Intel Core i3 or an AMD EI processor along with Kali Linux disk image, right? So the best disk image that you'll have is the AMD 64 disk image, right? So next up, we talk about the features of Kali Linux. Now, Kali Linux is extensively used in the cybersecurity industry. So one of the most important things is forensic mode. Now, forensic mode is basically a mode in Kali Linux where it is equipped with tools made for explicit purpose of digital forensics. So it is extremely helpful for ethical hacking and cybersecurity engineers because the entire operation of digital forensics can be made on Kali Linux using forensics mode. Next, we come to full disk encryption. So when we talk about full disk encryption, this basically talks about the ability to encrypt the whole hard drive of our critical penetration testing computer because it is very vital when it comes to the industry, right? Now, disk encryption is important because it has certain, say, files whose integrity cannot be broken, right? You need special permissions to access those files. And when you have hackers and cybersecurity engineers working continuously on the security of their system, they will use Kali Linux because it's completely foolproof and secure. So finally, we talk about the 600 penetration testing tools that are pre-installed. Basically, Kali Linux comes with more than 600 useful tools like Wireshark, like Crunch, Nmap, and 𝐴𝐶RACK-NG. So let me tell you about a few of these. So like Nmap. So Nmap basically stands for network mapper, right? So in Kali Linux, Nmap means that a utility is widely used by penetration testers for a network discovery or a system security audit. So users find Nmap useful because of the fact that it allows various activities including network inventory, service uptime tracking, managing schedules, host monitoring, and as such. So this is all about Nmap. Then we basically come to Wireshark. Now, when we talk about Wireshark, Wireshark is basically a free and open source packet analyzer. So packet means a network packet. Now it is used for network troubleshooting analysis, right? So you basically analyze the network packets that go to and from one point to the other when there is communication required. So basically, Wireshark is an open source packet analyzer and it is used for network troubleshooting, analysis, software, and communication protocol development. So it is basically something which was used mostly as a packet analyzer and used for domain names and all that, right? So this is basically all about the features of Kali Linux. Next up, we come to the steps of installation. Now there are various steps of installation when it comes to installing Kali Linux. The first most basic step is the boot screen. Now the boot screen is basically a screen to start the installation, right? You boot the system with either a CD or a USB or let's say a virtual machine that you have. So whichever installation medium you have chosen, you will be greeted with a boot screen which will ask you how you want to install your Kali Linux, right? So you can either choose graphical install or text mode install. So generally people use graphical install. Next up, you'll have to select a language. Now, when you have to select a language, you'll basically have to select a preferred language on the next screen after you select graphical install. After selecting the language, you get to select your location, and after that, you basically have to configure your network, right? So, configuring your network starts with entering a host name. So, the image is copied to our hard disk, and our network interfaces are probed, and then we are prompted to enter a host name for the system. So, when you enter a host name for our system, you can enter anything. You can say Kali Linux, you can say Kali, you can enter your own name for a host name actually. After that, you have to configure the domain name, right? Which is also part of configuring the network. So optionally, configuring the domain name and entering a domain name can be used for a system to be used by default. So that is also there, but it's not compulsory. But what is compulsory is entering your host name. Next up, we have the creating a user account. So we will need to provide a username for setting up the user account. The full name of the user is a very reasonable choice for this field. So after you've made the user account, you create a user ID. So based on the username provided in the previous step, a default user ID will be created, right? So you've given a username and your user ID will basically be that very username that you've used, right? By default. Now you can change this later if you want. After which you have to basically configure the time zone. Now we come to partitioning of disks and reviews, right? So this is where the installer will basically review and analyze our disks and offer us four choices, right? So basically the first option that we get is to use the entire disk and not have partitions in it. The second and third option will require us to configure the LMV. The LMV is basically the logical volume manager where you basically configure it based on your requirements. And the fourth option is manual. So you can manually basically partition your systems, and manual partitioning is basically done by experienced user for Kali Linux. And this is done because manual partitioning provides them with more granular configuration options. So you'll have to basically choose a partition method, after which you'll have to partition disks, right? So after selecting the partition method, you will need to select the disk that has to be partitioned and the type of partitioning scheme you want, right? So you can keep all the directories in a single disk or choose to have a distinct partition for the directories. So if you're not sure about all the options, the safest is to go with all the files in one partition. Next up, we have the configuring of the package manager. Now, configuring the package manager will basically require you to configure network mirrors, and we will need to enter proxy information if needed. So if you do not have proxy information, you will not be allowed to install packages from the Kali repositories, right? So next up we have the installation of grub. Now grub is basically Grand Unified Bootloader. Now that is basically a tool for booting and loading operating system kernels and the default bootloader for system based on Linux kernel, right? So grub is basically nothing but the default bootloader for Linux. So it first runs when the machine is first turned on, and then regular users don't really see grub actions because it functions automatically and has no user input required. And finally, after this, you can see that the Kali installation page has popped up and you can now install Kali Linux. So next up, we come to the demo for installing Kali Linux. So if you go to Google and go to download Kali Linux, you'll get this. So what you can do is use this or this. I'll show you a method where you can basically use the disk image as well use the Virtualbox for that as well. Now what I'll be doing is I'll be using Virtualbox for both the bare metal version and the virtual machine version where I don't really have to make the installation process, right? So first what you have to do is go here, and when you're done here, you all you have to do is download the disk image from here. Once your disk image has been downloaded, it'll be something like this. So all you have to do now is open up your VirtualBox and basically create a new VirtualBox, right? So you can basically type in Kali 98 and try this. Kali 98 is basically the name of my VirtualBox, and let's say the memory size can be something like this. Go to next, create virtual hard disk, VDI, dynamically allocate your resources and have around 20 minimum of 20 GB, so I'll put in 25 GB. Create this, right? Now we have our Kali 98. So what you have to do is basically go to settings, and now you'll have to go to system, processor, and choose the number of CPUs you want. I'll choose 2. So if you look at general, shared clip object has to be bidirectional, drag and drop has to be bidirectional because you want to share files within the system, within your Windows system and the Kali system as well. Description encryption can be enabled, but we can choose not to if you want. So let's just keep it disabled right now. And if you go to storage now, you can see the disk image here, and here you get to choose the disk image. So you choose the disk file, and let's say you go to, right, this is the disk image you want, and after that you click on OK. So right now you've basically used that disk image. Now you want to install it, so all you have to do is press on start. As we talked about before, this is the boot disk, and I will choose graphical install, and I will basically choose graphical install and wait for it to come to the next option, right? So after the boot disk, you get to choose your language. So let's say English, and then let's say our region is India, so select that. Keyboard that you want is also Indian, so you want English, American English. It's already selected, so click on continue. So this is basically adding the other additional components that you need for Kali Linux, like basically the clocks and the other modules that you have. Let's say the grub installer, like we talked about, grub has to be there, and you don't really see it because it's always working when you first initialize the system, and this basically shows you that grub is running. Now these are other modules that you have for cybersecurity and bootloaders that you have. So let's wait for this to just finish up installing, and then we can move on to the next step. Next up, you'll have your network configurations where you have a host name. So my host name could be Kali, and we can just move forward with domain name and not have a domain name, to be very honest, because this is optional. So you need user account. So full name of the new user, let's say Gora, right? Right, so you get to choose your password, and so now you're basically setting up the user and passwords, basically setting up the clock like we talked about after you configure your network. And after you configure your network, you will come to basically detecting the disks and partitioning of disks. So you'll have partitioning of disks after you set up the clock. So let's wait for the options to come in. Right. As we talked about before, there are four options: guided, where you use the entire disk, and option 2 and 3, where you basically use the LMV, and fourth one, where if you're an expert at Kali Linux, you'll manually partition your disks. Right. So here I'll be using the entire disk for guided and continue with that. And this is the disk image and the partition basically. And just go to continue. Right. So all files in one partition. Right. So you want to finish partitioning and write the changes to disk, right? So now we come to if you want to change the partition to the disk. So just select yes and just go ahead. Now this is basically installing the system. So all that you have to do, let's say the grub has been installed already. So this is basically installing the base of the Kali Linux system. And in a while, you'll basically see Kali Linux has been completely installed into your system. So now we can see that you have to basically configure the package manager, and this is basically configuring the package manager. So you select the software. So if you want a high-end desktop environment, you have to select the �xFCE, right? Which is Kali Linux's default desktop environment. And this is what we want. So let's just click on continue. This is basically unpacking and installing your system. So you have to give it some time. So after you've successfully installed and configured the package manager, you'll get the option to install grub bootloader as well. Now you basically want to install grub into your already primary drive, right? Or you can install it manually. So this is basically what you have to do, and you'll see that it's basically having grub installed into your system, and grub has now been installed. So now we're finishing the installation where they're setting up the user ID, the username, the host name, and once it finishes up, you can basically use Kali Linux. So as you can see, the installation has now been complete. Now what you have to do is just click continue to reboot the system, right? So as you can see, Kali Linux has successfully been installed in our system with Virtualbox. Right then, so this is the home page that we have, and let's get going. Just try this. So now you have basically just logged into your Kali Linux system, and it's going to open up. So once you've logged in, this is what your Kali Linux system will look like, and this is basically how you install Kali Linux using VirtualBox, right? So this is the ISO file that we have used and mounted. There is another way to do this, so let me just quickly show you how that process. So just like we have the ISO file for the beta installer, we also have the VirtualBox for virtual machines, right? So what we do here is instead of using an image, disk image, we just directly import a disk image which can run on our VirtualBox, right? So if you just go to import and agree to this, you'll see that this is basically going to import the Kali Linux disk image, and then automatically you don't have to really do any of the processes that you did, like you configured your network, you selected a host name as username, user ID, location. You don't really have to do anything for this. This is basically just importing the Kali Linux disk image for VirtualBox and automatically installing it in your VirtualBox so that you can just start working on it. So you've basically successfully just installed the disk image using this. So you don't have to really make any of the installation processes. If you start this, what you will be seeing is basically the Kali Linux interface. Let's check it out. So basically what you can see here is the same thing is happening, except here you don't really have to make all the changes for network configurations, for username and the boot disk type of installation. All of that is already previously done for you. So this will basically give you directly an opportunity to access Kali Linux, which is previously installed using the disk image that you've just imported. And finally, you can see that your username and password have to be inserted into this for you to log in. And this is basically showing you that Kali Linux has been installed into your system. So if you want to install Kali Linux for VirtualBox or the ISO file, you can find the link in the description below. And this is how you install Kali Linux, right? With that, I come to the end of the session. Thank you and have a nice day.
I hope you have enjoyed listening to this video. Please be kind enough to like it, and you can comment any of your doubts and queries, and we will reply them at the earliest. Do look out for more videos in our playlist and subscribe to Edureka channel to learn more. Happy learning!